Have you ever kept a journal? And did anyone ever read it without your permission?
When Mom handed me that smoothie like it was some kind of Nobel Peace Prize, all pastel pink and topped with a sprig of mint she clearly thought made it elegant, I didn't flinch, didn't smile, didn't even blink. I just took it with a flat, automatic thanks. That didn't reach my eyes, then turned around and handed it to Sarah, who, of course, didn't hesitate to take it because Sarah never hesitated to take anything that was offered to her, or even things that weren't, and she brought the glass to her lips with that smug little smirk she always wore when she knew she was the favorite in the room. 2 minutes later, she was clutching her stomach on the kitchen floor, groaning like someone had punched her from the inside, and Mom's eyes locked with mine across the counter with a flash of something I'd never seen before. Not fear, not confusion, but recognition. Like she'd just realized I wasn't the same Maggie who used to nod and swallow the crumbs they tossed her. I just sipped my coffee. Black, no sugar, no milk. Just the way I like it when I want to taste something bitter. The chaos unfolded fast. Sarah doubled over, gasping, asking what the hell was happening to her, Mom shouting for someone to call an ambulance, her voice shrill with panic, but still somehow concerned more with appearances than her daughter's actual well-being. My stepfather, Jim, a non-factor in most family events unless there was grilling involved, lumbered in from the backyard with a confused frown, holding his beer like a peace flag. I sat at the table, legs crossed, watching the scene like I was observing it from behind glass, and not once did I look surprised. Not once did I reach for Sarah. Not once did I ask if she was okay. The truth is, I already knew she would be. I knew it wasn't serious. I knew. But let me back up, because you need to understand how we got here, how a smoothie became a weapon, how brunch turned into a battleground, and how years of being invisible turned into one moment of deliberate silence. That morning started like every other Sunday brunch at Mom's house, a little too perfect, a little too curated, like something off a lifestyle blog with captions like "grateful for mornings like this" and hashtags that meant absolutely nothing. There were fresh tulips on the kitchen island, quiche cooling on the stove, and matching plates that Mom only pulled out when she expected company worth impressing. Apparently, I didn't qualify. I'd walked in wearing my usual weekend uniform, jeans, sneakers, hair in a ponytail, and no one looked up. Not right away. What's funny, or maybe just sad, is that I'd actually curled my hair the night before. I'd picked out a soft blue blouse instead of my usual black because I wanted, foolishly, to be seen. I'd gotten the promotion I'd worked toward for nearly a decade, a real title that meant something, one of those career wins that finally makes your LinkedIn page look like success, and I thought, stupidly, that my mother might actually acknowledge it. But as soon as I stepped into that kitchen, I knew the celebration wasn't for me. There were balloons, literal goddamn balloons, in rose gold and white, taped to the wall behind the dining table. A sign read, "Congratulations, Sarah," in faux handwritten script. There were wrapped gifts stacked near her chair, a spa package brochure displayed like a trophy, and a stupid little crown waiting for her on a plate like she was turning 6 instead of 38. "Didn't you just win, like, a giveaway?" I asked, my tone flat but calm, eyes scanning the scene. Sarah grinned, already wearing the glow of someone who'd had 2 mimosas before 10 a.m. Well, it's a premium spa weekend, Maggie. It's at Willow Creek. You know, the one with the eucalyptus steam cave and the cold plunge waterfall. She tilted her head. Mom said it's a big deal. She wanted to make it special. I looked at Mom then, and she avoided my eyes, fiddling with the corner of a napkin like a guilty child, and for a moment, I thought she might say something. Might remember what she'd forgotten. But instead, she gave me that practice smile, the one that always felt like a polite apology for my existence, and said, "I was going to call you last night, sweetie, but I figured we'd talk about your thing later. You know, privately." My thing. My promotion to regional director. The one I'd broken my back for. The one I'd sacrificed relationships, weekends, and my own health to get. The one I told her about 2 weeks ago. The one she said she was so proud of over text. I didn't respond. I just sat down at the far end of the table, the chair with the wobbly leg that everyone always left for me, and I poured myself some coffee. The one ritual I could control. The rest of the meal went by in a blur of Sarah gushing about her weekend plans, Mom clapping her hands like she was watching a live performance of her favorite daughter's life, and Jim asking where the remote was. No one asked about my job. No one mentioned my name except when Sarah used it to laugh about how I still don't believe in facials. It was near the end, when Mom finally noticed the stiffness in my shoulders, the silence I wore like armor, that she walked over with that smoothie. "I made this just for you," she said, holding it out like peace in a glass. "Banana, chia, a little almond butter. Your favorite." I looked at it. Pale pink, cold, hand-delivered. Too late. Too obvious. I took it anyway. "Thanks." And then, without ceremony, without hesitation, I turned to Sarah, still grinning, still basking, and handed it to her. "Here. You try it. It's probably amazing." She didn't even hesitate. Just took it, drank half in one gulp, then raised her eyebrows like she was impressed. "Not bad. Could use more honey." 2 minutes later, she was on the floor. "Now here's the part where you probably think I poisoned her, right? Or laced it with something, or put in some kind of gluten-based revenge powder. But here's the thing, I didn't make that smoothie. Mom did. And I watched her make it. So tell me, if you saw your mother double-check a container twice before she poured it in, if you saw her taste a drop with the tip of her finger, frown, and still serve it to you with a tight smile, would you drink it? Or would you pass it on? And if your sister drank it without a care in the world, and it made her sick, would that really be your fault? Or just justice with a straw? You tell me. You don't wake up one morning and decide to hand your sister a smoothie that might send her to the ER, not unless that smoothie represents something far deeper, far heavier than chia seeds and almond milk. Not unless the hand offering it is weighed down by 39 years of being treated like an afterthought, a second plate, the person expected to smile while watching someone else unwrap the gift that was meant for you. People like my mother don't realize the weight of their choices because the hurt they cause comes dressed in compliments, in polite dismissals, in long silences filled with "I didn't mean it like that" and "you're too sensitive," until one day, without quite knowing when it happened, you stop trying to be heard and start listening for cracks in their smiles, cracks in the perfect performances, cracks in the blender lid as it spins one more time before it explodes. I suppose if someone were to ask when it started, this bitterness, this slow erosion of something soft that lived inside me once, I wouldn't know how to point to just one moment, because it wasn't about one moment, it was about thousands of tiny ones. Moments so small they almost don't seem worth mentioning, unless you've lived them, unless you've been the kid who got the smaller piece of cake because you're older and don't need as much sugar, the one whose science fair ribbon went on the fridge behind her sister's cutest smile award, the one whose field hockey scholarship announcement was completely eclipsed by Sarah's new part-time gig at a boutique yoga studio that paid in exposure and bath salts. It was always Sarah. And it was always me pretending it didn't sting. I remember being 11 years old and watching Mom brush Sarah's hair on the couch while I folded the laundry. Sarah was 7 then, her hair already long and blonde and thick like something out of a shampoo commercial, and Mom would run that wide-toothed comb through it like it was a ritual, like it was sacred, while I listened to the radio in the background and folded socks into each other with military precision. I asked once, just once, why she never brushed my hair anymore, and she said, without even pausing, "You're so independent, Maggie. You don't need me to do that kind of thing." I nodded. I swallowed it. I made myself believe independence was a gift. But independence, when you're still a child, is often just another word for loneliness. The years rolled on, and so did the patterns. I got my first real job out of college. She forgot to come to the dinner I planned. Sarah failed a class in community college. Mom called her professor and demanded a regrade. I stayed late at work to help my manager hit a deadline. Mom said I should slow down and not be so obsessed with achievement. Sarah took a pole dancing class and posted about it on Facebook. Mom commented, "So proud of you for expressing yourself, baby." I got promoted to senior HR coordinator. She texted "nice" with 2 exclamation marks and nothing else. And yet, despite all of this, or maybe because of all this, I kept showing up. I kept being there for birthdays, holidays, Weekends when Sarah needed help assembling IKEA furniture, or when Mom needed someone to drive her to a doctor's appointment she'd somehow forgotten to schedule transportation for. I kept smiling at dinners where no one asked me how I was, nodding through conversations that revolved entirely around Sarah's latest cleanse or Mom's HOA drama or Jim's sudden interest in wood carving. I told myself that being reliable was its own reward. But rewards don't look like being the one who stays silent when no one else remembers your promotion. Rewards don't taste like lukewarm coffee and dry toast while your sister unwraps a spa weekend paid for with a family credit card. And they certainly don't come in the form of smoothies handed to you with a forced smile by the woman who birthed you and then forgot to celebrate your life. That morning, before the brunch, before the smoothie, before the stomach cramps and the ambulance and the shrieking, I had come to the house early to help set up, not because anyone asked me to, but because I assumed, as always, that no one else would do it right. The kitchen was already in motion when I arrived, and I paused in the doorway, watching from the shadows for a moment that no one noticed. Sarah was upstairs, probably smearing on a 10th layer of highlighter, and Mom was in front of the blender, wearing her apron, moving with a kind of slow efficiency that felt like performance. Too careful, too staged. The smoothie ingredients were already lined up on the counter like they'd been curated for a photo shoot. Sliced banana, frozen berries, almond milk, a packet of protein powder, chia seeds soaking in a mason jar. I stood still and watched her as she picked up a small container, something unlabeled, unscrewed the top, sniffed it briefly, frowned, then poured it in anyway. She stirred the mixture, paused, dipped her pinky finger in for a quick taste, frowned again, and added a squirt of honey before tightening the blender lid. That frown stayed on her face longer than it should have. It wasn't disgust exactly, more like uncertainty. Then she turned and saw me, and just like that, the frown was gone. "Maggie, I didn't hear you come in," she said, cheerful, too cheerful, the kind of cheer that usually came after she'd realized she forgot something but didn't want me to know it. I didn't respond, just nodded and walked to the dining room to start laying out the plates. It didn't feel like much at the time, just another oversight, another barely hidden mistake, but it lingered in the back of my mind like a whisper. When she handed me that smoothie hours later, I didn't remember the ingredients. I remembered the frown. So when I took it in my hand and looked down at it, frothy, innocent, sickeningly pink, and then glanced at Sarah still gushing about whether she should go for the seaweed wrap or the volcanic ash mud bath, I didn't hesitate. I held out the glass and said, "Here, Sarah. Mom made this just for me, but I think you'll appreciate it more." She took it, grinned like it was a prize, and drank half of it before licking her lips and asking if it had cinnamon in it. What happened next wasn't instant. It never is, not when it's real. But within minutes, she started shifting in her seat, then gripping her side, then wincing, then saying something about a cramp, then leaning forward, eyes wide with something that finally wasn't smugness, but fear. And Mom, my mother, didn't look at Sarah when it happened. She looked at me. Not because I did something, but because I didn't stop it. And maybe that, in her mind, was worse. But what would you have done? Would you have drunk the smoothie from the woman who forgot your promotion but remembered your sister's spa win? Or would you have let someone else taste what it feels like to be forgotten? Maybe I didn't poison anyone. Maybe I just passed the bitterness along. There's something deeply humiliating about growing up in a family where you are tolerated rather than cherished, where your presence is expected like clean towels or stocked toilet paper, but never celebrated. Where love isn't something that's spoken or shown but rationed out in microdoses, offered only when you bleed for it or prove you're useful, and even then, you're expected to be grateful. My mother never outright said I was less important than Sarah. She didn't need to, because favoritism in our household wasn't a declaration, it was an atmosphere, a persistent undertow pulling everything toward my sister, leaving me in the background. Always half a step behind, always the support beam, never the star. You'd be surprised how loud silence can be when it lasts for years, how even a single empty glance from the person who raised you can feel like rejection pressed into your skin. After the smoothie incident, that's what I've started calling it in my head, because it makes it sound like something abstract, like a weather pattern or a traffic accident that no one's really to blame for things shifted, but not in the way you'd expect. Sarah spent a night in the hospital, pumped full of fluids and examined for every possible cause of her sudden stomach pain, and the official diagnosis came back as a reaction to something fermented, possibly expired. Maybe the chia seeds or the protein powder or a combination of both, they couldn't say for sure. It wasn't dramatic enough to warrant a lawsuit, not clear enough for a scandal, but it was just strange enough to leave a lingering unease in the air, like a fart in church. No one wanted to talk about it, but no one could pretend it didn't happen. When I visited the next day, Mom was already in full caretaker mode, fluttering around Sarah's apartment like some twisted Florence Nightingale, rearranging pillows, heating up bone broth, and recounting the story of the brunch in a tone that made it sound like a tragic misunderstanding instead of what it really was, an ugly crack in the perfect facade she'd spent decades crafting. Sarah, swaddled in a faux cashmere throw blanket with an eye mask pushed up like a tiara on her forehead, groaned about how she still felt nauseous and dizzy and how the hospital food had been literally poison. I stood in the doorway, coffee in hand, and watched as they performed their familiar ballet, Mom fussing, Sarah basking, the roles rehearsed and perfected over the years like an old sitcom no one's brave enough to cancel. When they finally noticed me, it was Sarah who spoke first. "Did you feel sick after the smoothie?" she asked, eyes wide, not with accusation but with genuine confusion, like the idea that anything bad could happen to her was so foreign it must have been divine punishment. "No," I answered evenly, taking a sip of my coffee. "I didn't drink it." She blinked, frowning as if that answer hadn't occurred to her. "Why not?" And before I could stop myself, I said it. "Didn't trust the ingredients." That was when Mom froze. Just for a second. Just enough for me to notice the twitch in her jaw, the way her hands paused over the tea kettle, the brief flash of something dark in her eyes before she smiled too wide, too practiced. "Oh, don't be dramatic, Maggie," she said, waving a hand as if waving away a fly. "It must have just been old protein powder. You know how sensitive Sarah's stomach is." There it was again, the lie wrapped in maternal concern, the subtle shift of blame away from her and onto something passive, something inanimate, as though ingredients had minds of their own. As though my sister's gut was a delicate flower, and I was the careless gardener. I wanted to laugh, to scream, to throw the coffee mug against the wall and ask her why she thought I would still swallow her excuses after everything, but instead I just nodded, because that's what I was trained to do. You nod. You agree. You minimize. You survive. Later, when I was alone with Sarah, Mom having gone to pick up a fresh batch of herbal teas that apparently help reset the digestive system, she turned to me, looking almost vulnerable. "Do you think Mom knew it was bad?" she asked, quiet, like it was a secret even she wasn't ready to fully say out loud. I looked at her for a long time. Really looked. And for once, I didn't see the golden child, the spotlight stealer, the vacuum that had sucked up all the attention in our lives. I saw someone uncertain, someone shaken, someone who might have just started to see the cracks herself. "I think Mom knows more than she says," I replied, letting the words settle in the air like dust. "But she also knows how to make it look like she doesn't." Sarah didn't respond. She just pulled the blanket tighter around her and stared at the television, where some reality show about millionaire matchmakers was playing, and I realized that for all her sparkle and selfishness, maybe she wasn't as invincible as I'd always believed. Maybe none of us were. That night, Mom sent a group text, just me and Sarah, with a cheerful message about how we should all be more careful with health supplements, and how she was just relieved it wasn't anything serious, and how, next time, we'll stick to mimosas. Followed by 3 laughing emojis and a heart. I didn't reply. Sarah sent a thumbs up. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the glow of the phone screen still imprinted on my retinas, and thought about how easy it was for her to reduce everything to a joke, to skip over the discomfort and land straight in the punchline. That was her gift, my mother, to manipulate reality not with force, but with a kind of gentle insistence, to push you into doubting your own version of events until you start rewriting the story in your head to match hers. She didn't need to gaslight you. She just needed you to be tired enough to let her do the storytelling. But I wasn't tired anymore. I was wide awake. And I was starting to think that maybe the smoothie wasn't the accident everyone wanted it to be. Maybe it was a mirror. And what it reflected was a family that had spent too long pretending everything was fine, a family where one daughter got spa weekends and sympathy, and the other got silence and secondhand smoothies. But not anymore. Because something had shifted. And whether they wanted to admit it or not, the balance was no longer in their favor. There's a particular flavor to the way women like my mother weaponize kindness, a syrupy sort of poison drizzled over everyday gestures until they rot from the inside out. And if you've ever grown up under the shadow of a parent who used polite smiles like knives and apologies like handcuffs, then you already know what I mean without needing a dictionary to define it. Because the worst cruelty doesn't come from screaming matches or bruised fists, it comes from the small, careful humiliations. You're expected to smile through, from being served a smoothie as a peace offering when all you really wanted was to be acknowledged for something you earned, something you bled for in silence, while someone else, someone prettier, lighter, softer, was given center stage and applauded just for showing up. In the days that followed, what everyone now referred to as the little scare, as though Sarah's sudden collapse in the kitchen was no more serious than a hiccup or a mild case of indigestion. The family slipped into a strange rhythm of denial masked as casual conversation, where every mention of the brunch came prepackaged with a half laugh and a shoulder shrug, as if we could just laugh it all away. As if laughter could bleach the underlying tension that now sat heavy in every shared room. Like the stink of mold you can't quite locate. Sarah recovered quickly, of course. She always did, and by the third day, she was back to posting filtered photos of herbal teas and bath bombs with captions about self-care after setbacks, and hashtags like #GutHealing and #BounceBackEnergy, which made me want to throw my phone into traffic. Not because I didn't expect it, but because it was just so on brand for her to turn even mild gastrointestinal distress into content. But it wasn't Sarah's recovery that unsettled me. It was the silence from my mother, not the absence of communication, because she called and texted and tagged us both in photos from the brunch, as if nothing unusual had happened, but the silence beneath her words, the careful omissions. The way she never once asked me how I felt about it all, never once followed up on whether I drank any of the smoothie or if I'd noticed anything off about it before handing it to my sister. It was as if the entire thing had been edited in real time, the narrative reshaped without my input, until the story no longer had room for my version of events. In her mind, I had simply chosen not to drink the smoothie, end of story. She never asked why. And that, more than anything, told me she didn't want to know. But I knew what I saw. I remembered watching her in the kitchen that morning, hovering over the blender with a kind of distracted focus, her fingers clumsy on the lid, her eyes flicking to the pantry and back again, as if she were unsure of what she was doing or trying to remember a step that didn't quite make sense. I remembered the way she paused after tasting it, just for a beat before adding honey, not to make it sweeter, but to cover something up. And I remembered, most clearly of all, the way she looked at me when Sarah doubled over in pain, not with panic or confusion, but with something that looked almost like accusation, as if she were waiting for me to admit something, or perhaps. And this was the part that made my blood run cold, to confirm something. It was on the 5th day that she finally said something that cracked the surface. I had stopped by her house after work because she'd left me a voicemail about extra food from her book club, and I knew from experience that extra food was code for an excuse to get you alone without it sounding like a confrontation. The table was already set when I arrived, 2 plates, 2 glasses of wine, a small bowl of quinoa salad I recognized from one of Sarah's health guru recipes, and a pie she claimed was sugar-free but still managed to smell like guilt and cinnamon. We sat, and we ate, and we talked about the weather, her garden, my neighbor's messy divorce, everything except the one topic that pulsed beneath the surface of every word. Until she put her fork down and said, casually, I was thinking, maybe it was a bad batch of seeds. I bought them in bulk from one of those organic co-ops. You never really know, do you? I looked at her then, really looked, and saw the tightness in her mouth, the slight tremble in her fingers as she reached for her wine, the way her gaze darted away from mine just a second too late. This wasn't about chia seeds. This wasn't even about the smoothie. This was about something deeper, older, something she'd been trying to suppress and now couldn't quite keep buried. So you think it was the seeds? I asked, voice even, nonchalant, the way you ask someone about the weather before you tell them the storm's already here. She nodded, too quickly. Yes, probably. I mean, Sarah's always been sensitive. She doesn't have your stomach. My stomach, I repeated, taking a sip of wine. You mean the one that's used to swallowing disappointment? She flinched, just a little, and the silence that followed was heavier than anything we'd said all evening. I didn't mean it like that, she said after a beat, and I smiled because that was the line. That was always the line, the universal shield of the passive-aggressive. The phrase that absolves them of all responsibility while placing the burden on you for having taken offense. I know you didn't, I replied, leaning back in my chair. That's the problem. We sat like that for a while, two women separated by decades of unspoken truths, eating quinoa salad and drinking red wine in a room filled with ghosts neither of us had the guts to name. She didn't bring up the smoothie again, and I didn't ask why she hadn't made one for Sarah that day instead of me. But the unasked questions lingered between us, thick as fog, and I realized then that we weren't ever going to have the kind of confrontation you see in movies, where the music swells and someone finally yells, "You never loved me enough." And the other person cries and repents, and everything gets better. No, our war was quieter, more sophisticated. It was fought with polite gestures and backhanded compliments and strategically offered smoothies that came too late. And the thing about quiet wars is that they last longer. That night, I walked out of her house with a Tupperware of quinoa and a plastic-wrapped slice of pie and a growing certainty that I hadn't been imagining things, that the smoothie hadn't been an innocent mistake, not entirely. Maybe she hadn't meant to make Sarah sick. Maybe she hadn't planned it at all. But deep down, in some unspoken place she didn't like to acknowledge, maybe she'd made it with the same carelessness she'd used to raise me, inattentive, dismissive, unaware of the consequences until they hit someone else. Or maybe, and this was the part that kept me up at night, maybe she'd hoped I'd drink it, and when I didn't, when I passed it to Sarah instead, maybe she saw a version of me she didn't recognize. A version that was finally tired of being the good daughter. A version that was capable of letting someone else feel what I'd felt my whole life, sick to my stomach and completely alone. And if she did see that version of me, I have to wonder, did it scare her? Or did it make her proud? Either way, she didn't say. But I think she knew. And I think, deep down, she knew I knew too. There's something disturbingly comforting about returning to the exact place where everything began to fall apart. Something eerily satisfying about walking into the same kitchen, placing your hand on the same counter, listening to the same hum of the refrigerator, and realizing that even after all the chaos, all the unsaid things, all the jagged pieces left on the floor after the smoothie debacle, nothing has physically changed, not the arrangement of the spice jars, not the cracked tile near the sink, not even the faint smell of lavender cleaner mixed with lemon rind, and yet, you have changed so completely that the space now feels like a set, a backdrop for a performance you're no longer willing to act in, a stage on which you once played the reliable daughter, the invisible sibling, the emotional punching bag, and now find yourself entirely unwilling to pick up that script again. It had been just under 2 weeks since the brunch that should have been mine but was hijacked, once again, by Sarah's unrelenting gravitational pull, and in that short stretch of time, I had managed to exist in 2 parallel realities. The one where I showed up for work, answered emails, ran team meetings, and politely accepted congratulations for my promotion with a smile that barely concealed the slow-burning fury underneath, and the other, quieter one, where I replayed the events of that morning over and over in my mind, dissecting the way my mother held the smoothie glass, the way her eyes darted toward the blender just before she handed it to me, the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, and most of all, the way she froze when I handed it off to Sarah without a single word of protest. I hadn't spoken to Sarah directly since that afternoon at her apartment, when she'd sat wrapped in a blanket, pale and unsure, Her usual self-assuredness dulled to a flicker and asked me if I thought Mom had known. I hadn't answered her fully, not because I didn't want to, but because part of me still wasn't sure what the truth was, or more accurately, I wasn't sure which truth I was supposed to accept. The one that made me the passive observer of an unfortunate coincidence, or the darker, more complicated version that whispered maybe I had been waiting for a moment like this all along, and when it finally came, I hadn't stopped it, hadn't warned anyone. Hadn't stepped in, not because I was cruel, but because I was exhausted. The day everything came to a head wasn't remarkable on its own. Just another Sunday, just another text from Mom, asking if I could stop by for a quick catch-up because she felt like we hadn't really connected in a while. As if the silence between us had been the result of mismatched schedules rather than deliberate avoidance, as if the elephant in the room hadn't grown so large it now pressed up against the windows and spilled into the backyard. I arrived late, on purpose, and walked into the kitchen to find her already seated at the table, 2 mugs of coffee in front of her, one with almond milk, mine, and the other black. She looked tired in a way I hadn't seen before, not in the physical sense, but something else, something deeper, like someone who had finally lost control of a story they'd been narrating for so long they'd forgotten what was real. For a moment, neither of us said anything. I sat down across from her, picked up the mug she'd set out for me, and took a sip without breaking eye contact. It was hot, bitter, strong, exactly how I liked it. That unsettled her more than anything I could have said. "I know what you think happened," she said finally, her voice too steady, like it had been rehearsed. "Do you?" I asked, not angry, not accusatory, just genuinely curious. She looked down at her hands, turning the mug slowly, the steam rising between us like fog on a battlefield. "I would never hurt Sarah," she said, and for a brief second, I almost believed she meant it. "I didn't say you did," I replied, setting my mug down carefully, deliberately. "But you were careless. And you know it." She shook her head, not in denial, but in resistance, like someone being asked to accept a version of herself she didn't want to recognize. "You think I favored her," she said, and I almost laughed, because how could that even be a question after all these years, after all the erasures, the omissions, the bright spotlights pointed away from me and toward my sister? "I don't think it," I said. "I lived it." The silence that followed was different this time, heavier somehow, as though we'd finally stepped off the script and into something neither of us knew how to navigate. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out a piece of folded paper, worn at the corners like it had been handled too many times. "I wrote this after your graduation," she said, pushing it across the table. "I never gave it to you." I unfolded the paper slowly, eyes scanning the neat handwriting that began with "My Maggie" and went on to describe all the things she had noticed, but never said, the late nights I stayed up studying. The way I always helped Sarah get ready for dances, even when I wasn't invited to any, the quiet strength I carried like a second spine. It was, in a sense, everything I had wanted to hear from her, a letter that acknowledged me, that saw me, that recognized the cost of being the one who always held things together. But it came too late. And it came after a smoothie that might have been nothing, or might have been everything. "Why didn't you ever give this to me?" I asked, folding the paper again. She didn't look up. "Because I thought you didn't need it." That was the answer, wasn't it? The thesis of our entire relationship, the justification she used to give Sarah more, to expect less from me, to explain away the imbalance as a reflection of my strength rather than her neglect. I was capable, I was stable, I didn't need the praise, the attention, the applause, and so I didn't get it. "You were wrong," I said quietly. "I needed it. I just stopped asking." She nodded then, a slow, sad motion that told me she finally understood, but also that it didn't change anything, not really. The damage had been done. The letter couldn't undo the years. The coffee couldn't cleanse the smoothie. The silence between us might have been pierced, but it would never truly be filled. I left shortly after, the letter in my purse, untouched. I didn't promise to come by next week, and she didn't ask. As I drove away, I thought about Sarah, about how she had texted me earlier that morning with a selfie from a juice bar, holding up a green smoothie and captioning it "Back on the health grind," with a laughing emoji and a flexed arm. She was fine. She'd always be fine. Because people like Sarah were built to land softly, no matter how hard they fell. And me? I didn't feel vindicated or victorious or even satisfied. I felt something quieter, something steadier, the knowledge that I had finally chosen not to protect them from themselves. That I had stopped swallowing things that were never meant for me. That I had let the cracks show. Maybe the smoothie was just expired. Maybe it was a careless mistake. Or maybe it was something more, a symbol, an offering, a line that had finally, irrevocably, been crossed. I didn't need to know for sure. Sometimes, the truth doesn't come with a confession. Sometimes, the truth is simply that you handed the smoothie to someone else, watched what happened next, and didn't look away. And if that makes me the villain in their story, so be it. Because I'm finally the main character in mine.